was a service diplomat of the Chinese Foreign Office who had served at the Chinese embassy in Paris and was fluent in French and English, apart from his native Chinese. The Tibetan plenipotentiary was Longchen Shata, which is often written as Shatra in English, but the pronunciation in Tibetan is Shata. A person of enormous natural intelligence, he had the confidence of the Dalai Lama and turned out to be a resourceful advocate of the concerns of the Tibetan government. Throughout, he remained in contact with the Tibetan government in Lhasa, Waikuria. For interpretation at the conference, he was assisted by British officers who knew Tibetan, which in a way militated against confidentiality of the work of the Tibetan plenipotentiary at the conference. The formal credentials of the three plenipotentiaries were exchanged at the outset of the conference and left no one in doubt that the three were assembling on the acknowledged basis of the equality of the three. From the outset, McMahon acted in the assumption that the British government wanted to secure from the conference a definite agreement on the boundary between Assam and Tibet. Among other objectives of the conference, regardless of the question of the status of Tibet vis-à-vis China, he was also aware that the Assam government, the Foreign Department of the Indian government, and the Survey of India did not have much information about the territory whose external boundary the British government now sought to define. Till then, British intercourse with the tribes of Nepal was limited to ensuring that no foreign government gained a footing in the area and that the tribes would have relations only with the British government, whose visible representatives in the area, the political officers and assistant political officers, were constantly on the move to remain in touch with the tribes. For the most part, the tribes were left to run their own affairs according to their traditional practices. Not being familiar with the ways of the trading communities of British India, the tribes were sought to be protected from the venal and exploitative practices of Indian traders by notifying an inner line as early as 1873. Indian traders and other Indians would need a permit to cross the inner line and go into tribal territory. It is a measure of the success of the British officers that whenever problems and difficulties arose between or among the tribes, they came to the British officers to settle their disputes. They did not go to Tibetan officers, then located in Sonazong, or the monastic officials at Tawang. No Chinese official was ever in sight or concerned with running any of the administrative or other functions affecting or concerning the tribes. In any case, the area to the north of Nepal was Tibet and did not touch on the boundaries of any Chinese province of southwest China. British exploration on the northeast frontier was pushed on with the greatest dispatch, and exploration officers furnished their reports to government as early as possible. McMahon devised all kinds of methods and ways to prolong the sessions of the conference in order that British exploration officers would have time to go on with their labors on the northeast frontier. McMahon played for time by inviting and allowing Tibetan and Chinese plenipotentiaries to state their respective cases in as much detail as possible. Chetta spoke about the Tibetan grievances and complaints against the Chinese and went into the details of the money value of objects destroyed by Chinese soldiers at various Tibetan Buddhist monasteries in the course of the years 1904 to 12, while Yifan Chen almost panicked because he was not prepared for the resourcefulness and detail of the submissions made by Shatta. One other means adopted by McMahon was to invite the Chinese and Tibetan plenipotentiaries to put forward their ideas of China boundary or the status of Tibet vis-a-vis China. This is brought out in broad relief from the record of the conference written in Tibetan by Shatta, but not to the same extent from the British record written by McMahon. The so-called Chinese record of the conference, published in English in Peking 1941, was largely similar to the British record and included several conference documents, although it was perhaps not an official publication. It seems that the compiler of that record had been in close contact with Yifan Chen and had access to his conference papers. It is interesting that the file of the Indian Foreign Department dealing with the Simla Conference is entitled Proceedings of the Tripartite Conference, and the other file dealing with the boundary between British India and Tibet in the Nepal region is called Definition of the Indo-Tibetan Boundary. Now, I like to talk about an exchange of notes between McMahon and Shatta, 24-25 March 1914, which led to the definition of the McMahon line as the boundary. For the purpose of defining the boundary, McMahon seems to have sought recommendations from the British political officers serving in Nepal, although his request seeking such recommendations is not on record. These officers knew the area well and sent their recommendations in telegrams addressed to the Assam government, which duly forwarded the same to the Indian government. These recommendations of the political officers became the basis of the boundary that McMahon Line eventually drew on the map known as the Northeast Frontier of India, General Staff Sheets 1 and 2, Provisional Issue, February 1914, scale 1 inch equal to 8 miles, which incorporated the latest researches of the British exploration officers. Since the line drawn by McMahon on these maps is at places as broad as 1/8 of an inch, the boundary is blissfully vague and could easily vary at places by as much as a mile. We should understand that in theory a boundary line will have a certain length, but it cannot have a width. In this respect, McMahon was responsible for introducing unclarity and vagueness about this boundary. This map was reproduced on a much reduced scale in Dorothy Woodman, Himalayan Frontiers, 1969. On 27 April 1914, the map was initialed. This map in 2 sheets was initialed A.H. McM by McMahon, signed in full by Yifan Chen, and signed in full by Shatta. But this proceeding was still called initially. This line was the one that became known as the McMahon line in later years. It is difficult to ascertain how the line came to be named after McMahon. It used to be said that the name was used first by McMahon himself in his address to the Royal Society of Arts, 1935. But the published record of that address does not contain the phrase McMahon line. I see Vinod is smiling. He probably knows how the line came to be called McMahon line. We will wait for the enlightenment. Yifan Chen either came with inadequate instructions from the Chinese government or he had inadequate understanding. of the situation that he was called upon to handle. As discussions proceeded apace, it became clear that he had no power to commit the Chinese government to recognition of Tibetan independence. He continued to insist from the beginning to the end of the conference that Tibet was always a part of the Chinese empire under various dynasties, and that Tibet did not have power or competence to enter into relations, treaties or agreements with foreign governments. If that indeed was his considered position or the formal view of his government, he should have walked out of the very first session of the conference. He did not. The first draft agreement of 27 April 1914, negotiated and drafted on a tripartite basis, was initialed by the three plenipotentiaries as representing an accurate statement of the position of each of the three on the two questions delineated above. For China, it was galling to be told of a Sino-Tibetan boundary wherever it was drawn. The British and Tibetan plenipotentiaries conveyed to the conference acceptance by their governments of the tripartite agreement, but the Chinese plenipotentiary continued to hedge and eventually conveyed to the conference the decision of his government to repudiate even his initialing of the draft agreement. He said that he did not have power to proceed to full signature of the document. Ifan Chain withdrew from the sessions of the conference, but McMahon and Shatta continued their labors, attempting to modify the agreement as far as possible to bring it in accord with the Chinese position in the hope that the tripartite basis of the agreement might be preserved. However, Ifan Chain remained without power to sign the agreement. Thereafter, the other two plenipotentiaries had no option but to declare that the agreement would be regarded by them as binding between them, and that the Chinese government would be deprived of the benefits and rights that would have accrued to it in the event of full Chinese signature of the agreement. That signature never came, although the three continued to tarry in Simla till the end of the appointed day and time, 11:15 p.m. of 3rd of July 1914. When the agreement was signed by Shatta and McMahon, but not by Ifan Chain. Thus ended the main session of the Simla Conference after 9 months of work, during which they must have gained understanding of the position of each of the three governments, and also the basic position of the Chinese government that Tibet was not to be regarded as an independent state, even if China was in no position to impose and enforce its view on the Tibetan government. For its part, although the British government never gave diplomatic recognition to the Tibetan government, the British government proceeded to treat Tibet as an independent state, free and able to enter into treaty relations with foreign governments. Working in that assumption, McMahon addressed a letter, 24 March 1914, to Shatta, in which he enclosed a map delineating the Tibetan boundary with Nepal area of Assam. He invited Shatta to signify the position of his government on the proposed boundary. Shatta wrote to his government in Lhasa and received from them authority to convey to McMahon acceptance by them of the boundary as shown on the map aforesaid. Shatta addressed a letter to McMahon, 25 March 1914, conveying to him acceptance by the Tibetan government of the boundary that McMahon had suggested. From McMahon's point of view, that settled the boundary. It is interesting to compare McMahon's line on the map with the recommendations of the Assam political officers. For the most part, the boundary followed the recommendations of the political officers, but it departed from their recommendations in respect of the boundary from a point on the watershed where it took a turn southwestwards to the Bhutan border at the western extremity of the boundary line. The area between the line suggested by the political officers and the one finally settled by McMahon included the Tawang tract. which doubtless was regarded by the political officer of western section of Nepal as an area under Tibetan control, including a major Buddhist monastery at Tawang, whose head Lama was appointed from Lhasa. The line recommended by the political officer would have brought Tibetan territory rather close to the settled districts of Assam, namely the Lakhimpur and Tinsukia districts, with their extensive British-owned tea gardens, a consideration that seemed to appeal to the British Indian government. But the line settled by McMahon abandoned the natural watershed of the range on which Sela and Sela, T-S-E, Sela, are situated, a line called by some scholars as the Sela range. This phrase has been used by Alistair Lamb. It is a moot point how far, at 1914, the area north of the Sela range was effectively administered by Tibetan officials, apart from the religious authority of the Tawang monastery, which perhaps had no civil or administrative functions. The Mon inhabitants of this area in the Monyul tract were similar to the tribes living in the adjoining areas of Bhutan. After traversing a course of some 850 miles from the Bhutan border, the boundary terminated at the Isurazi Pass on the Burma-Yunnan border. The easternmost part of Nepal, namely the Tirap area, was the last part of the territory within the British Indian side in Nepal, Assam. The rest of the boundary line described the boundary between Tibet and Burma, which too at that time was a British Indian province. Beyond Isurazi Pass, the territory on the other side was not Tibet but the Yunnan province of China. No attempt was made to treat the Yunnan-Burma boundary, which was perhaps outside the purview of the conference. Now, British attitude towards Nepal after 1914. Much has been written about how the conference was brought about, what happened at the conference, etc. But the commonly believed view has been that after 1914, the Foreign Department of the Indian government forgot about the McMahon line. This, in my view, is not correct. They never forgot about it. Officers like Lancelot Hare, who was Lieutenant Governor of Eastern Bengal and Assam. You know, Assam used to be part of the province of Eastern Bengal and Assam after the partition of Bengal in 1905 to 1911 when it was reversed. Lancelot Hare was Lieutenant Governor during this period. Lancelot Hare and Hardinge, the Viceroy, left enough on record to show that the British Indian government was aware of the possibilities and risks of the situation if it were left to drift. There was even some reference to an armed showdown between China and Britain and a realization that if such a showdown happened, the contest would not be decided by fighting in the Nepal mountainous area, but by a British attack on the coast of China. This is 1910-11. That lifted the matter out of the purview of the Indian General Staff and brought it squarely to the British General Staff, which by mid-1914 was already foreseeing possibility of a European war before very long. In the event, the European war began in August 1914 and continued to widen its area of operations until it became a world war. The European rivals of Britain at that time had little interest in the East, which would not impinge too much on the defenses of British India. The entry of Japan in the war pushed China into closer adjustment with the Allies. The perception of the Indian General Staff no longer gave prominence to the Chinese threat to the Nepal tribal territory or to Tibet in general, while the Republic of China was barely on its feet to come for much in the councils of the world. The urgency of meeting exigencies in the hills of Nepal may have passed, but that did not bring to an end the journeys and interests of the political officers and assistant political officers who continued to administer and tour their areas. Now, British administration of Nepal, 1914 to 46. That's the next part of my submissions. It is relevant to recall that in 1914, the northeast frontier had been reorganized into three sections, known respectively as the Western, Central and Eastern sections. The Western section constituted the administrative charge with its headquarters at Balipara, and the Central and Eastern sections constituted the second charge with its headquarters at Sadia. Each under a political officer assisted by two or more assistant political officers. With one exception of an ethnic Assamese officer who became an assistant political officer, all other officers were British officers throughout the British administration of Nepal. The entire tract was placed under an officer who came to be designated later as advisor to the governor for Nepal. This officer continued to operate until the end of British rule and perhaps even during the early years after independence. All these officers operated with devotion and attachment to the cause of the tribes entrusted to their care and continued to tour in their areas, as was the practice in the early years of the 20th century. Gradually, the entire area up to the McMahon line was brought under effective British administration, ensuring that no traces remained of any foreign authority or interference with the tribes. Whether that foreign power was Tibet or China, it could not have been China because any province of China was not contiguous with the Nepal areas, and during 1914 to 47, China was in no position to give attention to the area. There was no British interference with Tawang Monastery, which continued to remain related to the Lhasa monasteries and ecclesiastical offices, in consonance with the long-standing practice of British abstinence from interference with the religious pursuits and practices of the people. However, British administration in Nepal was different from the form that it assumed in the provinces of British India. There was no attempt to levy taxes in Nepal, perhaps because the tribes had little by way of economic activity that would qualify to be made the subject of taxation, or to institute a system of law and justice. For the most part, the tribes were left to themselves to organize their life in their traditional manner. British role was limited to ensuring that the tribes regarded themselves as subject to the British government and that no foreign government, which in the nature of things could only happen Tibet or China via Tibet, gained a footing among the tribes. It remains a moot point whether those who came as Buddhists to the monastery at Tawang were local tribes or Tibetans, and where they came from. There is no study of this subject. The Great Himalayan Range is geographically bounded on the west by the bend of the Indus in northwestern Kashmir, and on the east by the bend of the Tsangpo Brahmaputra in the northeastern part of Nepal. Nor is the Himalaya such an impregnable wall that it would be an adequate barrier of defense from external interference. In the time of British rule, there was India beyond the Indus in Kashmir and beyond the Lohit Brahmaputra in the east. The Lohit traversed most of its course in Nepal and was a tributary of the Brahmaputra. Even as watershed, the Himalaya has limited usefulness as a boundary because Indus and Brahmaputra cut right across it, as do several other rivers and tributaries all along its extent between these two extremities. The Himalaya watershed is far from being a continuous one, but generally the Himalaya watershed divides the rain waters to flow in opposite directions to the north or to the south. That brings me to the last part of my submission, Nehru and NEFA in 1946-47. After Nehru joined the central government as Vice President of Council in September 1946, the Governor General was President. In the earlier period, Wavell, later on Mountbatten. He took early steps, Nehru, took early steps for development in Nepal. It was perhaps here that he first tried and used his idea of planned development. Nehru continued the system of administration introduced by the British government during 1914 to 46 and strengthened administration in all parts of Nepal. Sources for this period should include Nehru's regular periodical letters that he wrote to the heads of provincial governments after independence. British administration had been spread to the whole of Nepal before independence. This can only be documented from the Assam archives for the period 1900 to 47, not all of which were forwarded to the Government of India. Existing writing on the subjects has been based on papers at the National Archives of India and the India Office records and Foreign Office records in London. This paper needs to be fleshed out with the use of papers from Assam Archives, National Archives of India, Tibetan Archives, and British Archives at India Office and Foreign Office. Thank you.
Thank you so much for two professors' presentations on the same issue, very hot issue of both historically and today, and that is really meeting up our conference topic when history and international relations meet. And first and foremost, thank you, Professor Meng, for your introduction to the origins, historical origins of the very border dispute of the two sides, and also your summary of the different interpretations of the two sides before and after the 1962 border war. And I find a very interesting part that you brought in your paper, that is the media and the parliament's role played during the either, can I say, pushing the policy making of the Indian government during Nehru's administration. And well, we definitely can discuss it later on. I'm very interested in how do you and other scholars would evaluate the media's roles or effect, political effect had on India's foreign policy making at that time, whether it shaped the final decision or just reflected the opinion splits among the political elites. Well, for your wonderful presentation, I must say that I'm very impressed with the detailed historical process, especially the similar conference that really kind of buried the seeds for the border dispute. While I'm sure that all others would feel very gratitude to your kind of presence of all the archival resources and the quotations to the paper, then arousing our kind of ideas and questions to the both of the historical process and the dispute of today. And then now I'll send the room open to questions, please.
Well, maybe just to similar conference. I think I have a question maybe for both of you, or perhaps more for Professor Meng. About the similar conference in 1914. In some of my previous work way back, I have done a lot of studies about Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was the president in 1914, but he also was a very important Chinese official at the end of the Qing dynasty. So I have studied a lot of the documents relating to Yuan Shikai and wrote a book, in fact, on the subject, not so much relating to foreign policy. Well, yes, in part. He was very close to the British. His relationship with Jordan and a number of others. His son, at that time, may have even been studying in London, I'm not sure. Yuan Kate was his eldest son, who was also, well, by that time was older. He was back in Beijing, I guess. But anyway, my point is that he was very close to the British. And I imagine was in his communications with Jordan, which you do cite, would be, are important in this respect. And I imagine other scholars have somehow looked at that. But I'm